الله أكبر.
It's undeniable that our perceptions of the world are shaped by the media we consume and reflected in that which we produce. Many of our interactions with other places start somewhere here, in children's books and movies. As you can guess, many of these representations are far from accurate, and sometimes just plain offensive. But even as we get older and gain more media literacy, are the news and history we consume truly better representations of those populations? And more importantly, how does the language we're exposed to implicitly and explicitly affect how we treat other cultures? Think of common figures portrayed in the media: a princess, a doctor, or a president. What your picture excludes or includes is likely different to that of the person next to you. Though not necessarily malicious, that picture is nonetheless inadvertently shaped by your biases, and that's true for nearly every imaginable term. A few words, though, are exceptions to this rule. One in particular is perhaps the most striking case study to this notion: terrorist. In its most literal sense, it refers to someone who utilizes violence and fear to achieve political goals. But it's evolved into something far more insidious: an implicit racial and cultural marker. Despite its markedly neutral and even broad definition, it is disproportionately applied to people of Arab and African backgrounds in both media and public discourse. As it turns out, this bias was not born overnight. It stems from decades of political events, narratives, and irresponsible cultural framing.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
But still, how has this single linguistic weapon shaped biases, laws, and interpersonal interactions? And how has it played such an instrumental role in creating and maintaining societal power structures?
There's no in between. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear.
The Western perception of Arab people has undergone significant transformations throughout history, but a recurring theme persists: exotifying and othering the population. The earliest Western representations were shaped by trade, exploration, and cultural exchanges during periods such as the Silk Road era from 130 BC to 1453. As early Western travelers, traders, and scholars were forced to address the unfamiliar Muslim faith, they began to depict the region as mysterious but morally suspect, filled with turban snake charmers and promiscuous belly-dancing women. This image was cemented by works like The Shaving of Shafat and Arabian Nights. Filled with magical elements, they all painted the Middle East as a land of genies, opulent palaces, and conniving magicians. In the same way, accounts from travelers like Marco Polo contributed to this portrayal of the region, focusing on its perceived sensuality, wealth, and danger. In total, the West's romanticized yet patronizing lens of the East rendered it as alluring, yet inferior and dangerous. These depictions were later analyzed by Palestinian academic Edward Said under the framework of Orientalism. Though, on the surface harmlessly fantastical, these early Western portrayals were not innocuous at all. Instead, they were part of a calculated cultural lens that served to assert Occidental superiority and later justify imperialism. They effectively reduced an entire region to stereotypes and paved the way for a skewed understanding of Arab identity, one that continues to influence narratives today. Early notions of the Middle East and its people marked the beginning of a narrative that has, over time, shifted from exotification to a much darker and more insidious form of distinction, delineating Arab culture as a monolith of lawless violence. In fact, European colonial powers relied heavily on these Orientalist stereotypes as a political tool to justify their domination and exploitation of Arab people and countries in the 19th and 20th centuries. By portraying the Middle East as lawless and in need of Western governance, colonial powers framed their imperialistic efforts as a mission to civilize. Art, literature, and photography were all tools used to perpetuate an Orientalist image of the Middle East. Examples of the most popular paintings from this time include Jerome's 1879 The Snake Charmer, or Eugene Delacroix's 1863 Arab skirmishing in the mountains and Arab horsemen attacked by a lion, which are all marked by the portrayals of Arab people in environments as primitive, violent, or almost inhuman. And, as it turns out, these narratives have very tangible consequences. France's colonization of Algeria from 1830 to 1962 relied heavily on propaganda designed to depict Algerians as primitive, violent, and incapable of self-determination. These stereotypes justified harsh policies, land grabs, forced labor, and systematic cultural suppression, such as banning the teaching of Arabic in French Algerian schools. French power structures portrayed this blatant erasure as a civilizing endeavor, while simultaneously repressing Algerian agency and identity. Likewise, British imperialism in Egypt utilized Orientalist narratives to legitimize control over the region. They framed their oversight of the Suez Canal, a strategic artery for global trade, as a project of modernization in progress, ignoring the exploitation of Egyptian labor and resources, and masking Britain's primary motivation to secure economic dominance. By depicting Egyptians as incapable of managing such crucial infrastructure, Britain justified its prolonged interference with Egyptian sovereignty. These fabricated narratives and colonial involvement facilitated endless systematic extraction. Resources, cultural artifacts, and wealth were stolen under the guise of preserving history and economy, enriching European powers while impoverishing local populations. Conservative guesses estimate that France retains more than 110 tons of Algerian gold and silver, and more than 180 billion of Algerian wealth, and that Britain still keeps 330,000 Mesopotamian and Arab artifacts, still displaying them as trophies of the empire. These two are a fraction of the appalling scale of extraction, gouging Middle Eastern and North African countries in just 2 centuries. Such drastic economic and cultural exploitation inevitably led to one thing in a number of forms: resistance. Resistance movements, both violent and non-violent, were pivotal in forcing European powers to withdraw from the Middle East and significantly altered the region's modern history. Though these movements underscored the agency of Arabs in rejecting colonial dominion, they duly contributed to the West's enduring portrayal of the region as an untamed and monolith of instability and violence. Resistance efforts were a direct response to the exploitative and suppressive reality of colonial rule, and represented a demand for dignity and self-determination. Strategies were diverse, including strikes, mass protests, and political organization. From the mass nationwide non-cooperation that undermined the Shah's grip on power in Iran in 1979, to the forceful civil disobedience inside the Palestinian territories in Israel during the First Intifada, to the Lebanese independence intifada that forced the withdrawal of Syrian forces in 2005, to the Kuwaiti youth-led Orange Movement, non-violent resistance in the Middle East abounded and was successful in ushering in electoral and legal reform. However, violent resistance was a defining feature of many independence movements, particularly in contexts where colonial powers used military force to repress dissenters. Just one example is the Algerian War from 1954 to 1962, which became a symbol of brutal conflict on both sides. The use of urban bombings, rural guerrilla warfare, and assassinations by Algerian independence efforts, paired with the French military's use of collective punishment, torture, and mass arrest, began a cycle of violence that soon became commonplace in the Middle East. As many colonial regimes sought to retain their control through such suppression, resistance groups saw no alternatives to engaging in the armed struggle, which eventually helped them lead to their liberation. In cases such as these, when non-violent efforts are tried and thusly ignored, it becomes imperative to utilize violent force in an effort to be heard and addressed. In Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man, for example, violent resistance is depicted in 2 crucial moments: the old couple's eviction as well as the Harlem Riot. Both of them feature violence against police as well as the burning of infrastructure like tenements as an effective form of protest against brutality and an oppressive state. While the movements in the Middle East had an ultimate goal of self-determination, their violent aspects became central to the Western narratives regarding the Middle East. After World War II, growing international pressure from recently liberated countries and organizations like the UN pushed Western powers to listen to the protests of the people they were occupying and formally withdraw from the Middle East. However, this retreat was hardly an altruistic relinquishment of control. In fact, many Western powers like Britain and the United States backed up coups against democratically elected leaders and orchestrated the creation of oppressive power structures to retain their dominance and continue securing vital resources. The CIA's 1953 Operation Ajax, for example, overthrew the democratically elected leader of Iran after he nationalized the country's oil industry, replacing him with an authoritarian puppet leader who ruled as an unconditional ally to the West. Under the Shah's leadership, Amnesty International wrote that Iran had, quote, highest rate of death penalties in the world, no valid system of civilian courts, and a history of torture which is beyond belief. No country in the world has a worse record in human rights than Iran." End quote. The United States and other Western countries were also responsible for instigating instability within these countries. From covertly funding right-wing rebels against growing socialist governments to setting up terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Islamic fundamentalist leaders like Osama bin Laden received direct U.S. aid and training. Civil wars and continued U.S. imperialism led to more than 600,000 Iraqi civilians dead, as well as 1 million more Afghan people dead, 3 million disabled, and 5 million refugees, about half the population. These interventions were often accompanied by narratives portraying the region as naturally plagued by violence and religious extremism, masking the consequences of intervention and portraying imperial actions as necessary to bring about peace and stability. By manufacturing chaos and leveraging it as a pretext for intervention, the U.S. created and maintained another cycle of violence, perpetuating civilian suffering in the Middle East and entrenching Western dominance in the region. This was in large part responsible for the beginnings of a second, more dangerous Orientalism in which the West perceived the Middle East as ideologically charged and volatile, and inherently at odds with Western values and interests. The subsequent rise of ideologies like political Islam and regional movements like Hezbollah further cemented this perception. They not only opposed Western-backed regimes, but also militarily challenged Western allies like Israel. Resistance leaders were often depicted as extremists rather than freedom fighters, and anti-Western groups demonstrated a formidable capability to resist external influence. Thus, the West continued shifting its narratives to portray these groups as threats to stability. These dynamics led to a portrayal of the Middle East that focused disproportionately on conflict, oversimplified the complex realities of a region that torn apart and exploited for over 500 years, and completely erased its demonstrated resilience. In reality, Arab resistance movements were as much about reclaiming cultural identity and agency as about political struggle. While legitimate struggles for autonomy and justice were sidelined by the West, the Middle East was continuously portrayed through a post-Orientalist, reductionist lens that ignored Western terror in the region. New American media was soon flooded with stereotypes against this region. And, after decades of tension and Western interference, the unforgettable happened.
My centre, important enough to bring to you, though, at this early stage, we believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
This is the World Trade Center on the floor.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
The September 11th attacks became a defining moment in shaping contemporary Western media portrayal of Arab Americans and broader public perceptions of the Middle East. The attacks immediately associated Arabs and Muslims with terrorism, and media outlets began amplifying this connection, often reinforcing Islamic stereotypes and homogenizing Arab Americans as inherently violent, despite the fact that most Arab Americans are not Muslim, and most Muslim Americans are not Arab. Post 9/11, creative works and news outlets often perpetuated anti-Muslim stereotypes and made recurring generalizations about the unassimilability of Arabs and Muslims. For example, Fox News garnered public outrage over the creation of a planned Muslim community center in New York. Similarly, the day of the attacks, notorious Islamophobic commentator Daniel Pipes stated, "I have a lot to say. This is my moment." Even more recently, we regularly witness Western tendency to leap to the conclusion that Muslims are responsible for terror attacks, such as a recent massacre of a Canadian mosque in which U.S. media tweeted that the Moroccan man who called the police was the sole suspect, when actually the perpetrator was a white French-Canadian man. On the other hand, when terror attacks are actually perpetrated by Muslims, they receive significantly more media attention, on average, 449% more than other groups.
It wasn't until after actually 9/11 where you really started to really question your safety as a Muslim in America. When we were in Philadelphia, an incident happened where a severed pig's head was thrown over one of the local Islamic schools in Philadelphia.
When a white terrorist attacks, they are often rendered individual with a psychological, sociological narrative. White people do not become suspect communities. Unlike when a Muslim commits an act of terrorism, he or she is seen as a representative of the faith and community.
In these ways, the post-September 11th climate has justified discriminatory policies such as the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which was enforced almost exclusively against Muslim communities, as well as the Bush administration's War on Terror, which occurred almost exclusively in the Middle East and claimed the lives of over 800,000 civilians. More recently, the rise of populist right-wing leaders like Donald Trump have negatively influenced public perception of Muslims and Arabs through policy like the Muslim ban, as well as public statements like,
I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there.
Did you mean all 1.6 billion Muslims?
I mean a lot of them. You look at what's happening with the Quran, it's a pretty scary thing. There's something there that teaches some very negative vibe. They do not respect us
Trump
at all.
supporters surveyed subsequent to these statements were significantly more likely to view Muslims as violent and untrustworthy, with 1 in 2015 stating, I think they should bomb mosques. I think they should because they keep coming here and making trouble. You don't know what they are. You don't know if they're bad people or good people. All of these factors contribute to harmful narratives about Arab and Muslim people under the guise of national security, framing them as perpetual outsiders and justifying ongoing military intervention and extraction. These portrayals are so pervasive that they have been deeply entrenched in Western pop culture, particularly film and television. Research indicated that Muslims are overwhelmingly represented as terrorists or villains in Western media. In fact, a 2021 study from the USC Annenberg School of Communication found that in the 200 top-grossing films in 2017 to 2019, less than 2% of speaking characters were Arab or Muslim, and almost every single one were portrayed in stereotypical or negative roles. From children's movies like The Adventures of Tintin to more mainstream ones like Taken 1 and Taken 2, Iron Man, Killer Elite, A Million Ways to Die in the West, and G.I. Joe: Retaliation, Arabs and Muslims are depicted as extremist terrorists. And even if the movie doesn't feature Middle Eastern influence or characters at all, jabs are taken at Arab people and culture. In a similar way, the Black community has a long history of caricaturization and generalization through countless malicious stereotypes. In Invisible Man, there are depictions like the Mammy, and a Sambo coin bank that follows the narrator throughout the story, even when he tries to expel them from his life. For all marginalized groups, it becomes nearly impossible to escape the shackles of an invasive and erroneous stereotype. This typecasting isn't isolated to the silver screen either. A study found by Dr. Evelyn Al-Sultani and Dr. Aaron Kaplan found that even when Muslim characters were portrayed more sensitively post 9/11, their stories still revolved around terrorism and proving their loyalty to the West. Shows like Homeland and 24 frequently reinforce these tropes, while framing the U.S. as a paternal and benevolent force, saving good Arabs from their evil Muslim adversaries. These portrayals of Muslim and Arabs in pop culture perpetuate a narrative of a Middle Eastern identity inextricable from danger, violence, and conflict, and effectively others an entire demographic. This actively reflects and amplifies a cycle of discrimination that impacts societal attitudes and policymaking. To end this centuries-long cycle of harmful portrayals, the solution lies in reclaiming the narrative, whether that be by amplifying Arab voices and contributions, being cognizant of implications of the media we consume and produce, or confronting stereotypes in education and policymaking. By choosing authenticity and nuance over fear and division, we replace caricatures of the Middle East and its people with stories that truly reflect its humanity, complex history, and dignity. Change starts when we demand better, from ourselves as well as those around us.